Carl Jung discovered something that changes everything we think we know about achieving success and finding peace. The moment you stop forcing life is the moment real power begins. And what he found in his patients who learned this truth will shock you. Throughout his career, Jung noticed a pattern that terrified him. His most burned-out patients, the ones drowning in anxiety and failure, all had one thing in common. They were trying to control everything. They pushed, manipulated, and forced their way through life. And the harder they tried, the worse things got. But then something would happen. They would hit rock bottom, give up the fight, and suddenly life would open up in ways they never imagined. Jung called this the Great Surrender. And once you understand it, you can never see the world the same way again. Jung was haunted by a question that kept him awake at night. Why do some people achieve everything they want while barely trying, while others work themselves to death and get nowhere? He found his answer in a place nobody expected. The ones who succeeded had stopped fighting against life's natural flow. They had discovered what Jung called alignment with the self, and the struggling ones were trapped in what he termed the tyranny of the ego. This wasn't just philosophy. Jung had the proof. In 1913, during the darkest period of his life, Jung treated a patient who would change everything. This person had tried everything to fix their miserable existence. Therapy, medication, willpower, positive thinking. Nothing worked. They controlled every detail of their life, planned every move, and tried to force every outcome. And they were completely falling apart. Jung realized he wasn't looking at someone who needed to try harder. He was looking at someone who needed to stop trying altogether. The problem wasn't lack of effort. The problem was that effort itself had become the disease. Jung started to understand something that most people spend their whole lives never learning. The ego, that voice in your head that thinks it knows what's best, is actually terrible at running your life. It operates from fear, from the need to control, from the desperate belief that if you don't force things to happen, nothing will happen at all. But underneath the ego's frantic activity, there's something much wiser. Jung called it the self. And the self doesn't need to force anything because it already knows where you're meant to go. Here's what made Jung's blood run cold when he discovered this pattern. Every patient who was forcing their way through life was actually working against their own psychological nature. They were like someone trying to sail a boat by blowing on their own sails. All that effort, all that struggle, and they were getting nowhere because they were fighting the very forces that could carry them forward. The ego believes it must control everything, or life will fall apart. But Jung discovered the opposite is true. When you stop forcing, when you surrender the ego's desperate need to control, that's when life finally starts working. Jung identified what he called the act of will problem. This is when someone believes that pure effort and determination can overcome anything. They wake up every day with plans, goals, strategies, and backup plans for their backup plans. They force themselves through difficult relationships, trying to make people change. They force their careers, pushing for promotions and recognition. They force their own emotions, trying to think positive and suppress anything negative. And they wonder why they feel like they're drowning. Jung realized these people weren't failing because they weren't trying hard enough. They were failing because trying itself had become the problem. Think about the last time you really wanted something. Maybe a relationship, a job, a goal you were desperate to achieve. Remember how you thought about it constantly, planned every detail, tried to control every variable. And remember how the more you pushed, the further away it seemed to get. That's not coincidence. That's what Jung called egoic forcing in action. The ego believes that thinking about something, worrying about it, controlling it, will make it happen. But all that mental effort actually pushes away the very thing you want. It's like trying to grab water. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers. Jung introduced a concept that sounds crazy until you understand it. He called it lowering the mental level. This means intentionally relaxing the ego's grip on consciousness. It means letting go of rational control and allowing the unconscious mind to work. Most people think this sounds like giving up, like being lazy or passive. But Jung discovered it's the exact opposite. When you stop forcing solutions through pure willpower, you create space for real solutions to emerge from a deeper place. This is how breakthroughs happen, not through grinding effort, but through surrender. Here's where it gets interesting. Jung had a technique he used himself during his darkest period. He called it active imagination. This wasn't meditation or visualization in the normal sense. It was a way of stepping back from the ego's constant need to control and direct, and instead letting the unconscious mind show him what he needed to know. Jung would sit quietly, and instead of forcing thoughts or plans, he would simply observe what emerged. Images, feelings, insights would bubble up from somewhere deeper than his conscious mind. And these spontaneous contents held wisdom his ego could never access through force. You might be wondering how this connects to everyday life. Most people live entirely in their egos. They believe that every problem requires a forced solution, that every challenge demands willpower and determination. And this creates what Jung called neurotic suffering. It's the exhaustion of constantly pushing against life instead of moving with it. The person who forces relationships becomes controlling and desperate. The person who forces their career becomes bitter when success doesn't come. The person who forces happiness becomes depressed because they're denying their authentic emotions. The forcing itself creates the suffering. Jung observed something that explains why so many successful people say their breakthrough came after they stopped trying so hard. It's because forcing blocks the natural flow of what Jung called synchronicity. Synchronicity is when meaningful coincidences happen that guide you toward where you need to be. But here's the catch. Synchronicity can't operate when you're forcing everything. It needs space, openness, receptivity. When you're gripping the steering wheel of life with white knuckles, trying to force every turn, you miss the signs pointing you toward a better path. The universe is trying to help you, but you're too busy forcing your own agenda to notice. Think about someone you know who seems to have life figured out. Not the person who's always stressed and busy, but the person who seems calm, yet things work out for them. Chances are, they've learned something most people never learn. They've learned to recognize when they're forcing and when they're flowing. They've learned to tell the difference between egoic effort and aligned action. Egoic effort feels desperate, anxious, controlling. Aligned action feels clear, calm, almost effortless. Jung spent his career trying to teach people this difference, because once you feel it, once you know it in your bones, everything changes. Now here's where Jung's discovery gets even deeper. He realized that when people force their way through life, they're not just creating stress and failure, they're actually blocking their own growth. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming your authentic self. And forcing is the opposite of individuation. When you force, you're operating from fear, from the ego's need to control outcomes. But individuation requires trust, surrender, allowing yourself to unfold naturally, rather than forcing yourself into a mold. The person who forces themselves to be successful might get money and status, but they'll never have peace, because they've built a life based on force rather than truth. Jung identified something he called the shadow, the parts of yourself you reject and deny. And here's what's fascinating. People who constantly force things are usually running from their shadow. They're so busy controlling and managing and pushing forward that they never have to face the parts of themselves they're afraid of. the workaholic, forces constant productivity to avoid feeling empty inside. The people pleaser forces themselves to be perfect to avoid feeling unworthy. The controller forces every detail because they're terrified of chaos. Jung realized that when you stop forcing, when you surrender, you have to face your shadow. And that's exactly what needs to happen for real transformation. This brings us to one of Jung's most powerful insights. He noticed that his patients who lived completely through their persona, their social mask, were the most likely to force everything. The persona is the version of yourself you show the world, the carefully managed image. And when you identify completely with your persona, you have to force constantly to maintain that image. You force yourself to be strong when you feel weak. You force yourself to be happy when you're sad. You force yourself to appear successful when you're struggling. This forcing to maintain the persona is exhausting, and it prevents you from ever being authentic. Jung documented patients who were so identified with their persona that they had no idea who they really were underneath the mask. They had spent so long forcing themselves to be what others expected that they had lost touch with their authentic desires, feelings, and needs. And then, something would happen. A crisis, a loss, a moment of complete breakdown. The persona would crack. The forcing would become impossible to maintain. And in that moment of surrender, something beautiful would happen. The real person, the authentic self that had been buried under layers of forced performance, would finally emerge. Here's what Jung found most interesting. The moment his patients stopped forcing was often the moment their lives started working, not because they became passive or gave up, but because they shifted from egoic force to what Jung called surrender to the self. The self, in Jung's psychology, is your true nature, the totality of who you are beyond the ego's limited perspective. And the self doesn't need to force anything because it's already aligned with life's natural unfolding. When you stop forcing and start listening to the self, you begin to make choices that are actually right for you rather than choices your ego thinks you should make. Think about the difference between forcing and allowing in relationships. The person who forces tries to make others change, tries to control outcomes, tries to manufacture feelings that aren't naturally there, and they create misery for everyone involved. But the person who allows recognizes that you can't force genuine connection. You can't force someone to love you, respect you, or treat you well. All you can do is be authentic, set clear boundaries, and allow relationships to develop naturally. This isn't being passive. This is being powerful in a way that forcing never achieves. Jung realized that forcing is always rooted in lack of trust. The ego doesn't trust that life will work out, doesn't trust that you'll be okay, doesn't trust the natural flow of things, so it grabs control and tries to force everything into place. But this lack of trust becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you don't trust life, you force. When you force, you create resistance and struggle. The struggle confirms that life can't be trusted, and the cycle continues. Breaking this cycle requires what Jung called a leap of faith. Not faith in religion necessarily, but faith in the deeper intelligence of your own psyche, faith in the self that knows where you need to go, even when your ego is terrified. Now here's where we reach the climax of Jung's insight. He discovered that there's a specific moment in every person's journey when forcing finally becomes impossible. It's the moment when the old life structure completely falls apart. The relationship ends, the job is lost, the carefully maintained image cracks beyond repair. Jung called this the dark night of the soul. And it's terrifying because the ego realizes it's not in control. Everything it tried to force into place has crumbled. But here's what Jung knew that the suffering person doesn't know yet. This breakdown is actually a breakthrough. It's the forced surrender that allows real transformation. to begin. Jung witnessed this transformation in patient after patient. The person who had been forcing everything would hit bottom. They would have no energy left to maintain the facade, no willpower left to keep pushing. And in that moment of complete surrender, something would shift. The frantic energy would calm, the desperate need to control would release, and from that emptied space, something new would emerge. Not something forced or manufactured, but something authentic, real desires instead of ego goals, genuine feelings instead of forced positivity, true direction instead of plans made from fear. This is what Jung meant when he said that when you stop forcing, everything changes. You don't become passive or weak. You become aligned. You shift from swimming against the current to flowing with it. And suddenly, the same effort that used to produce struggle and failure now produces ease and success. Because you're no longer working against your own nature. You're finally working with it. The person who stops forcing doesn't work less. They work differently. Their actions come from clarity instead of desperation, from intuition instead of anxiety, from the self instead of the ego. Here's the beautiful paradox Jung discovered. When you stop forcing, you gain more power than forcing ever gave you. Not power over others or outcomes, but power within yourself. The power to be authentic, the power to set boundaries, the power to walk away from what isn't right for you, the power to trust yourself and life. This is what Jung called individuation. It's becoming who you truly are instead of who you think you should be. And it only happens when you stop forcing yourself to be something you're not. Jung connected this insight to ancient Eastern philosophy. The concept of Wu Wei, effortless action, perfectly describes what happens when you stop forcing. Wu Wei doesn't mean doing nothing. It means action that flows naturally, without resistance, without the ego's desperate need to control. It's the difference between the dancer who forces every movement and the dancer who flows with the music. Both are moving, but one is fighting and the other is surrendering. And the one who surrenders, the one who stops forcing, is the one who becomes truly powerful. Let's bring this into real life. The awakened person, the one who has learned to stop forcing, moves through the world completely differently. They don't try to control other people because they've realized you can't. They don't force relationships because they know authentic connection can't be manufactured. They don't chase success desperately because they trust that aligned action will bring what they need. They don't suppress their emotions because they've learned that forcing positivity creates depression. They don't maintain a perfect persona because they've discovered that authenticity is more powerful than any image. This person has learned what Jung called conscious boundaries. This is different from forcing. Forcing is trying to make others change. Boundaries are protecting your own energy and space. Forcing is desperate and exhausting. Boundaries are clear and empowering. The person who stops forcing doesn't become a doormat. They become someone who knows exactly what they will and won't accept, and they enforce those boundaries calmly and firmly. This is allowing life to unfold while protecting your authentic self. This is power without force. Jung watched as his patients transformed from frantic, controlling, forcing people into calm, centered, allowing people, and their lives didn't fall apart like their egos feared. Their lives actually started working. They made better decisions because they were listening to inner wisdom instead of ego anxiety. They attracted healthier relationships because they stopped forcing toxic ones. They found work that fulfilled them because they stopped chasing what they thought they should want. They experienced peace because they stopped fighting against themselves and life. Here's what Jung understood that most people never learn. The ego thinks it needs to force everything or nothing will happen, but the self knows that life has its own timing, its own flow. its own intelligence. When you align with the self, when you stop forcing and start allowing, you tap into a wisdom far greater than your conscious mind. Solutions appear that you never could have forced into being. Opportunities emerge that you never could have planned. Synchronicities guide you to exactly where you need to be, but only if you stop forcing long enough to notice. The moment you stop forcing life is the moment you step into your real power. Not the fake power of control and manipulation, but the authentic power of alignment and trust. You stop living from fear and start living from faith. Not blind faith, but faith earned through the experience of watching life work when you finally stop fighting it. You become the person Jung described as individuated, whole, authentic. You stop trying to be who you should be and start being who you are, and everything changes. Jung's insight offers you a choice. You can keep forcing, keep controlling, keep pushing your way through life. You can maintain that exhausting grip on the steering wheel, trying to direct every detail, living in constant anxiety that if you let go, everything will fall apart. Or you can take the leap that Jung's most transformed patients took. You can surrender the ego's desperate need to control. You can trust the deeper intelligence of the self. You can stop forcing and start allowing. You can discover what Jung knew to be true, that the moment you stop forcing is the moment real life begins. So here's the question Jung would ask you. Will you keep forcing your way through life, or will you finally surrender to the wisdom that's been waiting beneath the ego's frantic activity all along? The choice has always been yours, but now you know what happens. When you choose to stop forcing, everything changes. If this resonates with you, if you recognize yourself in the pattern of forcing Jung described, leave a comment and let me know. Sometimes, knowing you're not alone in this struggle is the first step towards surrender. And if you want to go deeper into Jung's psychology and discover more insights that can transform your life, make sure you subscribe. There's so much more to explore about becoming your authentic self. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.